You know the story. After COVID, a lot of watches got really expensive. Especially highly desirable brands like Rolex, AP, and Patek experienced a demand for watches that far outstripped supply. Grey dealers jumped in and gave customers a way of skipping the line for that Daytona or that Nautilus. You just had to pay above retail. As this demand bubble has burst, prices have come down and availability has come up, which leaves the question, what does this mean for grey dealers? Are they all going to go out of business or what? We'll cover how grey dealers get a hold of their watches, how the grey market has changed, where the grey market is going. I'm not a grey market dealer, but I have some thoughts, and I also share my personal experiences with how to do business with grey dealers. Let's dive in. We have to start with how grey market dealers get a hold of the watches that they sell. There are a couple of ways they do this. Sometimes a customer is tired of their watch. They sell it to a grey market dealer to free up some cash. This happens, but for a lot of modern grey dealers, this isn't by any means their primary source of watches. Grey market dealers mainly get their watches from three sources. They get them from other grey market dealers, they get them from flippers, and they get them directly from ADs locally and internationally. Flippers are just like that customer that is tired of owning X or Y watch. The main difference is that the flipper is most likely selling a brand new watch that he or she bought and only bought it with the intent of reselling it at a profit. A huge chunk of grey market dealers' watches initially come from an AD though. This also happens in a couple of different ways that also shine a light on how the grey market and the relationship to ADs has evolved in the past 5, 10, 15 years. But, why would an AD even sell to a grey dealer is the question. Well, there are quite a few good reasons. ADs get their watches from brands themselves or some sort of distributor. Now, the interesting thing is that a lot of brands exert a lot of influence or even control over what an AD gets. An AD rarely gets to completely independently decide what they want in the store. You're, just as an example, not going to find one AD who only stocks white Omega Speedmasters, Rolex Daytonas, and Rolex Yachtmasters in titanium. Being an AD means you have to stock a broad assortment of a given brand's watches. Now, the problem with this is, for every super desirable Omega Speedmaster in white they get, they are also going to be saddled with an Omega DeVille that's going to gather dust in the display for years to come. And it's far from a given that an AD is going to be allowed to return unsold stock to the manufacturer after any period of time. Unsold stock is the AD's own problem. So, for the longest time, grey market dealers and ADs have done business. A grey dealer would walk into a store and say something like, hey, how about I take some of this stuff off of your hands if you give me a discount? Now, the AD might not be able to sell all these watches at retail, but the grey dealer may be able to sell these watches to somebody at 10 or 20 or 30% below retail. Now, the question you might be asking yourself is, why wouldn't the ADs sell them at a discount themselves? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, sometimes they do give discounts. 2 years ago, it was a lot less common, but a lot of brands are not that popular at the moment, and a lot of ADs will give a discount on some brands and some models from some brands. You just have to ask. I'm also just going to ask you to consider subscribing. It's important for me to make content that you feel is worthy of your time, and one of the best gauges of that is people clicking the subscribe button. So if you feel my content is something you enjoy and is worthy of your time, please click the subscribe button below. Thanks a ton. Anyways, ADs can legally sell to whoever they want and at whatever price they want. Both in the US and in the EU and probably most other places, there are rules regulating something called policies about minimum advertised pricing, or MAPs. Basically, brands don't want ADs to sell watches below a certain point because they're afraid it will devalue their brand. Legally, the brands can't completely stop a dealer from selling something at any given price, but on the other hand, manufacturers can regulate the behavior of the ADs by controlling access to their stock. So basically, if you advertise a discount or you consistently list your products below MSRP, we as a brand are not going to do business with you. So sometimes the AD has some stuff on the shelf that they've paid for that will never ever be sold at retail. Why not let a grey dealer have these watches at a discount? You recoup some of your losses and you free up space on the shelf for something else. Now, the grey dealers are not stupid. What often happens is that they say, okay, I'll take 5 Omega DeVilles off your hands, but then you need to sell me 2 Rolex Daytonas as well. The grey dealer is making the calculation on the total purchase and essentially hopes to make enough on those 2 Daytonas to break even, or even better, make a profit on the purchase as a whole. Now, finally, like I said, the dealers also buy stuff from each other, and they buy all sorts of stuff. You have to remember that this is a global market, so a dealer in Miami may have easy access to Royal Oaks, but have a tough time sourcing F. Pigeons. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, it's the other way around. So these dealers barter and trade to get a hold of the kind of watches that are popular with their specific local or regional clientele. In those sales, those Omega DeVilles also get sold. I like to picture them as watches that I call circling the drain watches. So they're bought at a discount from an AD, they are sold to another grey dealer at a further discount, and from there they get sold again and again and again until they hit whatever price matches what they can get sold at. There are also super dodgy ADs that systematically just sell watches out of the back door. It definitely happens, but eventually these kind of ADs usually get caught by the brands and end up being cut off. There were some super high profile Patek and Rolex brand ADs that got caught a couple of years back, and they're all more or less out of business now. But basically it's likely 80 to 90% of the source of grey dealers' inventory. So we're going to go to prideandpinion.com, which is Nico Leonard's business that sells grey market watches. What we're going to do is we're going to click on A. Lange & Söhne. Now, what do we see? Well, I know A. Lange & Söhne have a lot of watches, but Nico has one, a Saxonia. Breguet, at the time of clicking, he had none. Breitling had 7. F. Pigeon, he had none. Rolex, he had a ton. Now you can go through the catalog of all the brands they say they can sell to you, and you'll see that considering all these brands have thousands of SKUs, Nico has a total of 360 watches for sale, and a vast majority of them are limited to a very small number of brands. What you'll see is this mix of desirable watches and customer watches and circling the drain watches that I spoke about. So there was, at the time of clicking, a expensive Rolex Daytona that was being sold for a couple of $100,000. That watch, I'm certain, is a watch that Nico has bought with the belief that he can sell it for a massive profit. The same goes for a 2024 Rolex Explorer 2 or a 2024 GMT. Basically, anything Rolex is being bought with the intent of making a profit on it. But then he also has a couple of Breitlings, all of which are for sale below retail. I would put my money that these either come from customers who bought an expensive watch from Nico and the watches got folded into the trade, or they are a mix of these circling the drain watches that he got from another dealer or an AD as part of a bigger buy. If you go to most grey dealers, you'll see a similar picture. They've got some desirables and some filler circling the drain type of watches. Not that these are bad watches, they're just not popular enough to be classified as desirable. Somebody wants them, but they're not desirable models. Now, some grey dealers do their bread and butter business with these circling the drain watches, while others, I think Nico is more so, play to more exclusive, heavy hitter, desirable type of watch space. Nico is definitely in that space. What I described above was basically the model that's been in place for the longest time. Things changed back in the late 2010s. And if you were paying attention back then, you'll recall the stories of how some brands actually had to buy back the stock of their watches to ensure their brand equity didn't collapse. It was Cartier, it was Omega, it was a couple of others. They had to do it because these brands had pumped out far too many watches and were overflooding the market. Brands since then have, for the most part, learned the lesson and have a much better feel for what sells, and they also don't pump out too much junk onto the shoulders of the ADs. It's not in their interest, and that means the overall supply in the market has declined. And yes, there's still an oversupply. You can never hit it one-to-one, but there's definitely a better control of supply from the brands because it's better for their brand equity. This helped change things for the grey dealers. On average, there was less unsellable inventory to take off of the hands of ADs, and the discounts they could get were lower. That might sound like a bad thing, but what it mainly did was allow grey dealers to move a little bit upmarket price-wise and close the gap to retail pricing. They are first and foremost, or have first and foremost, been an overflow mechanism. And when there's less overflow, the price drop is also lower. Now, the second change was the investment mindset. Before COVID, grey market dealers were primarily, like I said, an overflow mechanism for watches that were priced well above demand. All grey dealers did was get you a watch that you wanted at a lower price. After COVID, grey market dealers to a much larger degree had a new selling proposition. They could sell you the possibility of skipping a waiting list for a premium. That's how you need to think about it. They weren't selling you a watch that was worth more. They were selling you a watch where you paid a premium for speed of access. As overall demand has dropped, the premium for speed of access has come down. Buying a watch and selling it above retail isn't a new thing, but the extent to which it happened massively increased after COVID. Now, because being a grey market dealer doesn't as such have much of a barrier to entry in terms of skill or technical limitations, anybody that can raise capital could become a grey market dealer. So we got more grey market dealers, and grey market dealers really leverage social media to present themselves to the world and to sell their inventory. Then demand dropped, which meant prices started to come down and supply essentially felt like it increased. Some grey market dealers went out of business because they basically had over-leveraged themselves in terms of stock that they couldn't sell above the cost price that they paid. Especially the more grifty dealers tanked their businesses, where at least anecdotally it seems to me that the more experienced long-term players saw the dip coming and were quick to adjust, plus they likely weren't quite as heavily leveraged as the more grifty dealers. They basically didn't have as much cash locked in inventory that they couldn't get off their hands. The fourth thing that's happened is Rolex and certified pre-owned. It's a thing that's been pioneered by Rolex, but with stores like Booker are now expanding their lineups to other brands as well. This is a mechanism for ADs to sell used Rolex and other stock and in a way compete with grey dealers. It also gives brands like Rolex to, together with ADs, assert more control over the total supply of grey watches. Just keep in mind, though, that CPO, as I remember, requires the watch to be at least 3 years old to qualify, and some dealers I know at least will not buy your watch if it's still on sale as a retail, new, non-discontinued lineup model. CPO has been a bit baffling to me because the prices are so incredibly high. I expected that from the very beginning. I did a video about that almost more than a year and a half ago, but I've had some conversations with CPO dealers, and to be clear, and this is purely anecdotal, the ones I've spoken to, they don't feel that a lot is moving at the current very, very high prices. CPO is consistently above the pricing of grey market dealers, so it's not really a competitor to grey dealers. This is for AD customers who don't want to go to a grey dealer but want the safety and convenience of an AD and have no problem paying a premium for it. Does restrict supply a little, but it probably won't in a meaningful way impact the grey dealers. We'll get to what this all means for the future of grey dealers, but first, here are my tips on how I deal with grey dealers. First of all, I can't recommend any specific grey dealers. There are just too many, but I can start with saying there are three groups of grey dealers. There are local dealers that operate in your town or country. There are regional dealers that operate, in Europe or Western Europe or the US or parts of Asia. And then there are fully global dealers. For all of them, do your due diligence. All things being equal, verifying a local dealer is sometimes easier than verifying some unknown Asian or global dealer. Local review sites, Facebook forums, trust engines, and maybe people can give you a sense of how trustworthy a grey dealer can be. This isn't, and you've heard this term before, it's not about buying the watch, it's about buying the seller. You need to check before you engage in a deal. If you go to a global dealer, remember to factor in taxes, duties, and tariffs that likely apply. When watches cross borders, the price usually goes up. Check what they actually have in stock if possible. I'm regularly on places like Nico's site, Chrono24, and some local dealers, and I always check what they actually have on the shelf. I look for real photos and not just stock photos. I sometimes call and inquire if I can get a watch immediately or if there's a wait. Generally, on the popular stock, the better grey dealers usually have some level of stock, where the ones I have less trust in have 99 to 100% of their products unavailable. They basically lean on sourcing by order, and sometimes they even want you to pay up front or a large amount up front, and that's low risk for them, but to me it gives me concerns about their liquidity and to some extent sometimes to their sourcing practices. Generally though, I wouldn't expect grey dealers to have a ton of stock outside of whatever they specialize in. So some, like Nico, is doing a whole lot of Rolex. He's always going to have a whole lot of Rolex, but I'm not going to expect him to have FP Journes lying around. There's much more of a pay to order thing going on than there was 10, 15 years ago. Now, earlier I said there were these hot stock models and the circling the drain models. Generally, I've had success with haggling on anything they actually have in stock. Often, a listed price on Chrono24 is a starting point for negotiation, and that applies in general, but at least in my experience, especially in the case when they have it in stock, they're typically willing to negotiate. So I had an example, I saw it on Nico's site. He had a 2020 Omega Seamaster chronograph for sale for, I think it was about 50,000 Danish kroners, and the retail price is 73,000. So 23,000 under retail, which is a good price. And I suppose it is. But I would be willing to bet that Nico didn't willingly source this watch. This is not a hyper popular watch. It's not a special Olympic edition, something. So he either got it in a trade from a client buying something else, or he got it as a bundle from an ADE or some other grey dealer when getting some actual desirable stock. This watch might even be on commission, so the price may not have been agreed yet with the owner. In any of those scenarios, Nico & Co would likely be fine with getting it out of their stock sooner rather than later. And if that means knocking it a little bit off the price, then they will likely be open to discussing it. Think again of it in this way. Any stock that a grey dealer owns is cash that is tied up that can't be used to buy other stock. I try to negotiate. Grey dealers, just like ADs, also need to get rid of their dogs as well. And these guys, and I mean this in the most positive way, they are hustlers. They need to move stock, and moving stock is often more important than getting the exact asking price. They'll, just like in any other deal, they'll deal with you based on chemistry, but also based on how long they think that watch is going to sit in the window and wait until an actual paying customer walks through the door. Now, as for selling to a grey dealer, know two things. One, currently they hardly ever pay you cash upfront for your watch. If they do, you're likely getting a worse price than you would on commission. Commission is basically handing the watch over to the dealer and allowing them to try and sell it. The reason they do this is, again, because of liquidity. Every time they buy a watch, they're removing cash or liquidity, which they could use to buy something more interesting. The second thing to be aware of, if a grey dealer takes your watch on commission and they go out of business, you do not get your watch back. You are a creditor, and like all the rest of the creditors, you have to get in line and file a claim with get bankruptcy court or whatever applies in the relevant country. So where to from here? Some grey dealers like to talk about how increasing Rolex prices are going to kill ADs, and honestly, I don't think that's the case. Easily available gold Rolex models has historically been the norm, and dealers still make bank on Datejusts and Submariners and steel GMTs. They might take a hit here and there, and just because they give a discount does not necessarily mean they're losing money on a gold Sea Dweller. But if they're selling some, especially if they're selling some diamond earrings and necklaces as a package deal to a customer, they are still likely making a decent profit on the customer as a total part of the deal. Grey dealers are, at least for the time being, returning to what they have historically been: an overflow mechanism for less desirable inventory, and, in fairness, still a mechanism to skip the waiting list on some models. Grey dealers will continue to serve their purpose, but their prominence is largely a function of watch market activity. When the market is stable or in a downturn, they are doing fine, but they're basically not that interesting. Right now, a lot of watches are available directly from dealers. There are shorter and shorter waiting lists on a lot of Rolex models. Gold and two-tone is becoming readily available in some parts of the world, just like it was in 2017, 18, 19, and 20. This is nothing new. And remember this: ADs are allowed to sell at a discount. They're just not allowed to do it systematically. See what the AD can do in terms of pricing compared to the grey D, and then make your choice based on that. Grey dealers are going to be fine. They're needed, and both the overflow and the line skipping value proposition is a useful one for us watch buyers. Right now, the power is actually with the customer, regardless of whether you walk into an AD or you call your grey dealer. That's my thinking, at least. Now, my experience with greys is, of course, especially focused on the Nordic and European grey dealers. I would love to hear how these perspectives resonate with US, UK, and other markets. What are you seeing? What are your tips? Let me and everybody else who watches this video know in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.